Welcome to the first episode of The Gift of the Jab, a short podcast series in which we'll be talking to key members of the UK Vaccine Task Force about what it was like to be part of the biggest, most complex vaccination programme in UK history. I'm Tessa Walton.
And I'm Sue Williams. Both of us were fortunate enough to be part of the task force ourselves. My main role was heading up the supply chain team, looking after supply chain risk and resilience and the inbound planning of the vaccine.
And I led the initial design and planning of the vaccination programme in 2020 for the NHS before working on the supply side of the task force along with Sue. So why did we decide to make this podcast, Sue?
Well, we knew that lots would be written about the vaccine programme itself. And actually, because we've signed NDAs, we can't talk about the detail of the vaccines or even some of the processes. But what we can talk about is the experience of being part of the vaccine task force team. We wanted to make sure someone captures the voices of the people who were involved. I've also got to admit that partly I wanted to create a record for when my memory fades in 20 or 30 years' time, and just to remember that it actually happened. So I posted a request onto the VTF alumni page on LinkedIn. People responded, and here we are.
And we've ended up talking to a great group of people. We've got representatives from industry, from pharmaceutical companies, from the civil service, from the forces, and we've got project managers and the programme director, pharmaceutical experts and non-pharmaceutical industrialists. Sarah from the Air Force, business consultants. You'll hear all of their voices over the next 4 episodes. So it probably makes sense to start at the beginning. So I was working really closely with Ruth Todd, the Vaccine Task Force Programme Director, when I was leading the NHS England design and planning for the COVID vaccination programme for the NHS between June and November 2020. Ruth asked me to join the Vaccine Task Force to lead the deployment interface across UK partners, to use my knowledge of the delivery end of things. It was a huge privilege to be part of both sides of the programme. Ruth Todd, the Programme Director, felt a similar sense of awe when she was approached to head up the VTF.
It was a huge responsibility, and it's not one that anyone would say no to. I mean, I think all of us felt like that we were involved in an endeavour that was essential to the nation. So it was a really easy call up to answer.
It was actually Ruth who phoned me about joining the team and literally said, "Your country needs you." It was all a bit surreal. Sarah Lawson, who was operations director at SMD, an oil and gas company at the time, and joined the commercial team on the VTF, had a similar response.
It was surreal, I think, in terms of, can you please do this? And then for once, it feels like you are, I mean, we all do our daily jobs, and within reason, you understand what's going on in your current sector that you're working in. And sometimes that has a global footprint. But this felt like it was part of the news cycle, never mind a sector. So you'd actually be working on something, and then you would turn on the news and it would be reporting what had been happening with the group that day. And it might not have been something I was specifically working on, but it would be something that you've sat in a meeting, and they've gone through the various projects that were going on. And then, like I say, you turn on the news at 10 o'clock and there's the VTF being talked about, which was just, that was fairly unique.
The point Sarah makes about the scope of the project and how we manage different aspects of the programme as a team is interesting. Here's Ruth again.
Although we ran, and I think this is true across the task force, we ran a pretty flat structure. So we had in that group, we had scientists from who ex-GSK, we had manufacturing folk who are ex-GSK, we had scientists from academic institutes, we had health officials. So Jonathan Van Tam's a name people know pretty well. We had Maddie McTurnan, who's the Vaccine Task Force Director General now. She at that time was working for UK government investments, and she did all the deals. And then we had some other civil servants like me who were looking after things like strategy and so on.
Ruth's observation about a flat structure is true. From my perspective, I was used to working for Ruth in previous roles, so I was quite comfortable with the style. Because of the lack of structure, it needed someone who was going to grab hold of it and give us clarity and direction, but also let us work and get on with it. And that's absolutely what Ruth brought to the table. I was much less used to the government type environment and found some challenges with adjusting to the paperwork and reporting and some of the requirements that gave us. But generally, I was pretty comfortable in the environment, only really struggling when it was the more civil servant approach.
Sarah also talks about how the project brought together people from different backgrounds.
I think really that team being pulled together and all having the one goal, it made starting to work with new contacts and new colleagues really straightforward. And I think there was a trust piece where you just went in, and I was in the commercial sector, but immediately I was working with technical experts, project managers, legal, and you just had to assume that all of those people were enrolled because they knew what they were doing. And fortunately, on the teams I was working with, it was always proved right. And so it was quite a quick step to introductions and then, right, let's start working together. And we all knew what we were trying to do. It was a very clear objective. And I think that made what could sometimes be quite a lengthy process or difficult process when you're working in a normal environment, shall I say, where you're trying to work out who your colleagues are and what you've got in common. It just cut through all of that, and really it was, right, get this done.
I agree with her about that sense of common purpose. I spoke to an enormous number of people and all of the suppliers in the role that I had, and definitely was a hugely positive approach in that everybody wanted to do the right thing. But it did take some time to get everybody speaking the same language and understanding what each of us was saying. My background is engineering manufacturing, which is quite different to some of the language being used in pharmaceuticals, which is different again to the language used in government. So we definitely had some moments where no one really knew what the other was saying, and there were definitely language and cultural differences. Ruth's role in particular reflected the nature of the VTF's work.
I came in and my job was to be programme director, sitting as part of that leadership team to manage the end-to-end supply of vaccines, so the vaccine delivery work. And the programme director basically picked up anything that needed to be done, whether that was supporting the guys who are doing the clinical trials, so the NIHR, National Institute for Health Research, supporting them in how they were going to set up their capacity to be able to handle quite a lot of people, because we made that part of our offer to some of the vaccine companies that they could access the UK for clinical trials, putting up laboratories because we expected to need to do a lot of testing ourselves, through to managing the vaccine suppliers themselves and managing the supply of vaccines. I think at peak we had 25 projects running, all of which sat under this banner of Programme Director.
My role actually changed over the course of the project as well. When I started, very much the role was about building planning processes and standardising things, vaccines coming online to ensure the interface with UK partners was joined up and joint planning was in place. It was very much about building those relationships. A few months down the line, I took on logistics, supply chain, working with USU and security, which made sense as it was all connected. But those teams were changing due to secondments. And it was key to really make sure that we had the handover and recruitment of people with the right skills at the right time. Other people like Dr. Jasmine Key, who also comes from a pharmaceutical background, had a similar experience.
So I had a number of different roles, and it changed over time. So initially when I joined as a project lead, mainly to interface with the different vaccine manufacturers that the UK government was interested in partnering with to supply the vaccine to the UK. Initially, I was interfacing with 3 of the different vaccine developers that form part of the UK portfolio. And over time, because of my pharmaceutical and life science background, I think I was one of 2 or 3 at the time when I joined the VTF with that background. I was asked if I could support other projects as well from a technical perspective, not just my project manager's perspective. Which was great, and it wasn't an issue, but it did become quite the workload. So I proposed to the VTF that we grow the number of industry representatives helping with the day-to-day operations and execution of the task force work. And so that led to me changing roles and setting up what we called the technical team, which had experienced professionals from industry with different backgrounds. People who had a regulatory background, a clinical background, a manufacturing background, and so forth. And so I assembled that team and became technical director towards the end of 2020.
That combination of project management and technical expertise was characteristic of lots of team members. Anil Mistry, who would normally operate as an independent pharmaceutical project manager, joined the team to look after one of the vaccines as a project manager.
I've also got technical capabilities in the pharma industry. So I was both a project manager and a technical lead for that. And that meant that I had to find out what was going on with the AstraZeneca project, where it was at, and then make sure we communicate that into the government, but also monitor it and help them progress it towards NDA submission and so forth.
It wasn't just roles that had to flex, though. This was an agile project on every level. Alistair Kirk, a major projects and project leader, highlights the extraordinary pace of decision-making needed in the early days of the vaccine task force.
The whole structure of the VTF was geared around making decisions quickly, and we certainly did that. With the key decision made probably just before my time was around what technology platforms to actually support and get behind. And I think when I went through the assurance report, we had about 300 candidate vaccines or technologies initially, and the scientific advisors and our technical experts managed to whittle that down to backing sort of six key vaccine technologies. Of which, of those six, there were four sort of different technology platforms. And getting that decision right at the front end, what we call shots on goals and having a portfolio approach, probably more by judgment than luck. The four vaccine platform technologies that we focused on, they all delivered over a period of time, which I think was an exceptional technical judgment. But I think once the technology is proven, the supplies came on board, we were then able, I think, to get more into a business as usual approach with the vaccine task force. And I think one of the products of that was to start to sort of normalise the governance process and start to get more of the civil servants in the lead in the projects and make sure that the learning and the experience that we've built up started then to become more embedded in day-to-day practices within various branches of central government.
I'd agree with Alistair's take on how the pace ebbed and flowed. I'm not sure we could have kept up that initial tempo for the whole project. Ian McCubbin, a pharma industry leader and manufacturing lead for the vaccine task force, noticed a shift in pace in early 2021 and felt it had its pros and cons.
During this sort of mobilization phase, pace was incredible. Leadership was very, very flexible. Systems and control was probably less strong. During this sort of preparation for delivery, that was a really interesting time because, of course, as well as all the work with the companies and the preparation for having vaccines available, there was a whole mobilization events in the NHS, which I guess stretched the collaboration a bit further, actually, as I recall it. And then once we sort of progressed into 2021, the early part of that was, I think, a lot more control. In some ways that was better, and in some ways that was worse, because there's a lot of money being spent on this. So from a control point of view, that was good, but from a progress and pace point of view, it was not so effective, if I characterize it that way.
From my perspective, there wasn't really a change in pace. Even before the vaccines came in, we were planning for it. And then when they did start to arrive, we were focused on trying to understand how that would impact and be released out into the nations.
I agree with you. Tessa? Pace was just relentless from beginning to end. I certainly, though, had some sleepless nights. When I was leading on the NHS side, I remember just waking up in the middle of the night and thinking, the scale, it was just, we were planning for unprecedented activities and there was so much ambiguity. Having the responsibility to get it all right was overwhelming. For Ian McCubbin, it was when the mood shifted from we've got nothing to lose to we've got something to lose that the sleepless nights really kicked in.
In the beginning, it was a bit like, there's nothing to lose here. The probability of actually getting something that was able to vaccinate people in a short space of time is so low that we just got to give it our best shot. We've nothing to lose. But probably the time when I went, wow, this is pretty critical now, was round about October, November time in 2020, because we really could see that there could be a vaccine. And all of a sudden, there was something to lose as opposed to nothing to lose. And that's when it's always harder to deal with it. And there's I think that's when I had my most frequent sleepless nights, just wondering how we were going to do all of this. And that's when I was working very closely with Ruth, and the majority of the project management team, who were absolutely amazing at what they did to make sure the vaccines were actually available.
In the next edition of the podcast, we'll take a closer look at what seemed an almost impossible dream